what I thought I'd do is give you a little bit of context to background to the research that we've done, but also a little bit of thinking and some kind of pondering fodder for you about this recession, depression, downturn, whatever you'd like to call it, because in some ways it's very similar to previous ones that we've been through, and in a couple of ways that we're going to talk about, it's very, very different. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of audience participation, which I know everyone hates. It's not too dangerous. Anyone know what this is? It could be. It is a recession. It's the start of a very important recession.
The Dow Jones and the
Perfect. It is the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the run-up to Black Tuesday, October the 29th, 1929, which is the first major economic downturn of the 20th century. Now, that was caused by a number of factors that are kind of keep repeating themselves throughout the last 110 years. Legislation was one of them. In 1927, something called the McFadden Act was passed. And what that did was it stopped banks expanding outside of their home states in the US, which meant that they couldn't take advantage of economies of scale, and it became more expensive for them to service their customers. Something else happened as well. People had been, during the roaring 20s, spending far more than they could afford to pay back. So they borrowed more than they could afford to pay back. Sound familiar to anyone? Yeah. And inflation had made it difficult for companies to be competitive, which caused a lot of layoffs, a lot of lack of jobs, and eventually in 1933, huge runs on financial institutions and banks, with people taking their money out of banks. If we fast forward now to just 13 years later, in the UK, the age of utility. In 1946, we had huge problems here because manufactured goods and products and food were available in very short supply. And that led to the launch of a number of utility products. And I'm going to talk later on this morning about how utility is back, but in a very different way from how it was in 1946. Let's fast forward again to 1991. Now, this is a kind of downturn that clever people like Tim say has no obvious proximal cause. It's hard to pinpoint where this downturn came from. Generation X had just entered the workplace. There were threats, well, there certainly was unrest and threats of war, or at least intervention in the Middle East, and banks collapsed. Sound familiar? Fast forward again, 2007. Legislation played a part, and this time it's about the lack of legislation. So banks were selling on packets of debt to one another, like you wouldn't believe. No one could work out who owed what, and people had been spending too much, so couldn't afford to pay back what they borrowed, causing a collapse, eventually, of Northern Rock, and a run on its branches with people trying to get their money out of it, much like this previously. However, this downturn is different. It's different for two reasons. Our government has responded to it faster and more aggressively than ever before. In fact, in 2010, when the Comprehensive Spending Review was announced, we cut no less than £81 billion off our spending in the UK. And as a result of that, we partnered up with Paul from Trajectory, because what we wanted to do was find out not just the effect on people's spending, but the effect on what they were thinking. So what we'll be doing today is showing you not just who's going to have less to spend on what, but how they're coping and why. We've come up with two very simple numbers for you to remember, 7 plus 3. Ray's going to talk about 7 coping strategies that people are adopting and are going to adopt in increasing numbers and increasing volumes. And then I'm going to talk about 3 large trends that are being accelerated by all of this and which you can take advantage of. For each of these coping strategies and trends, there's a right side and a wrong side to be on. And what we're hoping to show you is that it's possible for brands not just to survive, but to thrive in these very difficult economic times.